Toward the end of summer in 2017, I started hanging a camera around my neck like the ancient mariner's albatross and going for long walks around New York City in the evenings. I was living alone on the Upper West Side again after 7 years of being tucked away with my family in an affluent New Jersey bedroom community. I discovered during those years that I wasn't cut out for suburban living, or at least that was my wife's opinion by the time she got around to asking me for a divorce. I was a freelance Photoshop artist and a marginalized novelist who'd been making a fairly decent living in New York City since my arrival from Seattle back in 1999. In 2007, my wife and I had sold our two-small apartment on West 72nd Street for a huge profit just before Wall Street's subprime lending fiasco burst the real estate bubble in 2008. We'd sat out the worst of the downturn in a rented apartment on West End Avenue with great views of the Hudson. Then, when we thought prices had stabilized in 2010, we bought a big, beautiful old house out in Montclair, New Jersey. Our real estate market timing had been almost perfect, but buying that house still turned out to be one of the most expensive mistakes of my life. I can't say it was all bad. Owning my first house brought me pleasures that I hadn't anticipated. I found out that I liked gardening, for instance. I also loved having a big backyard for our dogs to romp around in. What I didn't like was the lawn maintenance required during the spring and summer months, and shoveling snow from the long driveway during winter. I also hated all the extra unplanned-for expenses. The basement flooded during our first year in the house. That cost us $5,000. The next year, my wife wanted a landscape designer to spruce up our front yard, another $5,000. Then the plaster ceiling in the dining room started falling down in chunks. The front porch needed new steps, and the back deck needed repainting. $3,000, $4,000. I can't even recall the exact amounts now. There were so many little checkbook draining disasters like that. To make things even worse, my freelancing income had plateaued right around the time we moved from the city. About 5 years later, it started drifting lower. Meanwhile, I'd been caught between the twin pinchers of rapidly escalating property taxes and health insurance costs. Maybe you felt that pinch yourself. For me, toward the end, those two expenses sucked up almost half of my annual income. And the irony was that our annual property tax bill was rising so fast that it was eroding the resale value of our home, while our health insurance provider was always finding new ways to deny coverage for our medical expenses, despite the premiums and deductibles we paid, which amounted to over $20,000 a year. It felt like the extortionists were in charge everywhere. I was spending 3 hours a day commuting, and it was beginning to seem like financial suicide to own a home in New Jersey. My wife thought otherwise, of course, but she wasn't the one who had to work for a living. So a few months ago, I moved into a tiny third-floor walk-up on West 76th Street, between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive. My wife took the lioness' share of the equity in our house and used it to buy another, even bigger house in one of Montclair's glitziest neighborhoods. Justin Bieber is rumored to own a mansion just up the street. That's how those differences of opinion tend to go when your marriage is falling apart. Like buying a home at the wrong time in the wrong town, a marriage that ends in divorce can also be a form of financial suicide, mirroring larger trends at work in our society. I was reminded of that recently while reading Mark Greif's concluding essay, Thoreau Trailer Park, in his book called Against Everything. The passage I'm thinking of goes like this. No one could deny that private Wall Street banks had, in 2008, nearing collapse, made themselves whole with billions from the taxpayers' treasury and put great sums from the rescue into their own pockets. They took taxpayers' money and foreclosed on taxpayers' homes. They unhoused the middle class while the executives renovated their third and fourth and fifth vacation houses. But principally, banks, brought back from the brink of death, cast their weight and all the power that democracy restored to them against democracy, spending the citizens' money in election funding and lobbying to ensuring that good old laws, born in the Great Depression, retired in the 1990s, which had prevented such profitable and self-destructive speculation, could not be restored. Banks spent the citizens' money to guarantee they were heard before any citizen. That pernicious form of lobbying and legislation described by Greif has now become so common that we have a name for it: regulatory capture. It's a less inflammatory way of saying that American democracy is dead, and we now live in a kleptocratic corporate oligarchy ruled by criminals. Thanks to unfair economic policies that benefit those at the top at the expense of everyone else, the three richest white men in America, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, now own as much wealth as the bottom half of the U.S. population. We're talking about approximately 163 million people there. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you're a college graduate saddled with crippling student loan debt. Maybe you have a steady job, but you've seen your wages stagnate for the last 10 or 15 years while the cost of almost everything has gone up. Maybe you once thought you belonged to America's shrinking middle class, but then you watched your wealth evaporate in the wake of the Wall Street bankers' 2008 financial coup d'etat. Maybe you've been financially screwed over in some new and insidious way that most people haven't even heard about yet. So what do you do when corporate America and its entire MKULTRA culture seems to be aligned against you? Well, if you're like me, you opt for isolation, or silence, exile, and cunning, as James Joyce put it. You find out what it's like to live a simple life, all alone. Sunset. I walk, leisurely and distracted, down to the George Washington Bridge. A close friend of mine, a bridge engineer, has told me about a rogue public art project on the eastern shore of the Hudson. Someone has been stacking rocks, pulled from the river, into human forms. Sisyphus stones, the artist calls them, after Albert Camus' famous philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. The gods had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, the essay begins. Just as Sisyphus neared the top, the boulder's weight would overcome him and it would go tumbling back to the foot of the mountain. It was an exercise in futility, or a lesson in what Camus dubbed the absurd. Not all that different from working at any dead-end job when you think about it. Camus tells us that Sisyphus's passion for life, his hatred of death, and his scorn of the gods had won him that unspeakable penalty in which the whole of being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. Again, not all that different from our own futile endeavors. Don't kid yourself, the 80 hours a week you're putting in at Goldman Sachs, or your new job as a creative director at Saatchi & Saatchi, is not going to change the world in any meaningful way. Nor will this video, although you already knew that, right? But here's the thing. Camus says, there is no fate that cannot be surmounted by scorn. In the moments when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain, back to his rock, to find his burden again, his consciousness of his fate is his victory. His situation is absurd, unwinnable, but the struggle itself, toward the heights, is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus concludes. The way he sees it, Sisyphus is an absurd hero. Just like all of us. Except Jeff Bezos. That guy's a prick. My most recent book, Crash Gordon and the Illuminati Underground, is a satire about the most oppressive corporate leviathan the world has ever seen. In that book, a sociopathic plutocrat named Jeff Bezos has teamed up with the Gnostic demiurge, Yaldabaoth, to become one of the world's richest men, even though the corporate behemoth that Bezos is in charge of, Glamazon, has only lost money for 20 years straight. Yaldabaoth is the Lord of the Archons, a demonic schemer much like Satan or Mephistopheles, who's thrilled with Glamazon's potential for global tyranny.
Warehouses on every continent full of drones and robots and underpaid wage slaves,
Yaldabaoth gloats.
Veritable arcs filled to the rafters with every crap consumable and junk product the world has to offer. One Amazon Web Services builds out cloud-based data storage and computing networks for everyone from Netflix to NASA to our dark brothers in the CIA.
It's not all that different from what Jeff Bezos has actually accomplished with Amazon. If anything, Bezos is even further along the path toward world domination. He owns the Washington Post and uses it as his personal propaganda tool to manufacture consent for the regulatory capture schemes that will allow him to control the underlying infrastructure of our economy. Already, Amazon captures nearly $1 of every $2 spent online by Americans. And Amazon Web Services controls 44% of the world's cloud computing capacity. Liberty Media chairman John Malone went on CNBC the other day to colorfully describe Amazon as the Death Star moving into striking range of every industry on the planet. It's all about scale, Malone explained.
If you're selling anything to any consumer anywhere on the planet, you got to believe that Amazon is going to have a look at that opportunity to commoditize you
and then use its massive scale to crush your margins. As Jeff Bezos likes to say,
your margin is my opportunity.
Capitalism isn't about justice, it's about arbitrage. So why should we trust profit-hungry corporations to work in our best interests, to refrain from global ecocide, to preserve freedom of communication and expression, or even give us an honest accounting of their sales figures? Corporations are, by their very nature, amoral. One of my favorite independent journalists, Caitlin Johnstone, recently summed up the situation like this, quote, Bezos continues to get cozier and cozier with the U.S. power establishment as his empire metastasizes across human civilization. He kicked WikiLeaks off Amazon servers in 2010. He scored a $600 million contract with the CIA in 2013. He joined the Pentagon Advisory Board in 2016. He hung out with Defense Secretary James Mattis in August, and he spent nearly $10 million this year lobbying the federal government, which is likely what led to an NDAA amendment gifting Amazon a $54 billion market it's expected to dominate as a supplier to the Pentagon. Unquote. When I published Crash Gordon and the Illuminati Underground in September of 2016, I predicted on page 528 of that book that my fictional Jeff Bezos would surpass Bill Gates as the world's richest man by the year 2020. As it turned out, Jeff Bezos actually achieved that goal only a short year later, with a net worth of over $100 billion by the end of November in 2017. However, to justify and maintain that net worth, which is based almost entirely on the insane multiple that Amazon stock trades at today, Amazon will have to be worth 25% of the U.S. economy in 5 years. Billionaire investor Sam Zell did the math on that one, not me. But if his numbers are correct, does anyone really believe that Amazon will account for 1/4 of our national GDP by the end of the same 60-month time span which most people use to pay off a subprime loan on a new minivan? I sure don't. But, of course, harsh reality proves me wrong all the time.
Alexa, would you lie to me?
I always try to tell the truth. I'm not always right, but I would never intentionally lie to you or anyone else.
Alexa, what is the CIA?
The United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA.
Alexa, are you connected to the CIA? Alexa, are you connected to the CIA?
Clearly, we live in a depraved new world. Demons, vampires, and zombies are just cartoonish metaphors for the predatory people we meet all too often in real life. Most of us, however, live as inverse vampires, rise into consciousness each morning in a body that needs sunlight, food, and warmth. A body that makes us vulnerable to exploitation because it must be fed and clothed and housed. A body that will one day surely die, ejecting our consciousness into the great who knows what.
Maybe we could stop for a donut or so. Out here, there's nothing but trees. Black sky, winter time, one
Are we here for a reason? Are we spiritual beings having a human experience? Or are we just meat puppets, random bags of biology, shitting, farting, and sneezing our way through a material world governed by inescapable laws of entropy and decay? Is the universe indifferent to our collective fate? Does mankind lurch from one war, genocide, economic meltdown, or environmental catastrophe to the next with no one in charge? No one really calling the shots? Or does a shadowy cabal of billionaires enthralled to demiurgic urges manipulate the world's historical process, even down to the level of individual mind control? And is that somehow preferable to thinking that nothing is connected to anything, and there's no meaning to life at all? Ask yourself this. When we die, does our consciousness just switch off like a TV, or will we encounter the soul-crushing terror of a godless abyss? Or worse, an afterworld haunted by demiurgic taskmasters? Or will there be a heaven for us where nothing bad ever happens? And until we arrive at that heaven, hell, or absolute nothingness, as we all inevitably will, DOA, shouldn't we all just party and have a good time? We can sleep when we're dead, right? Why should we obey the grim social imperative to place material gain over incessant genital licking? Having as much fun as humanly possible might seem like the ideal response to our existential quandary, but what if you've always shied away from family get-togethers, Christmas caroling, and Greenwich Village orgies featuring full nude body painting? What if dressing up in a sad bunny suit and shaking your fuzzy-wuzzy junk in a parade isn't something you'd enjoy doing? What if you think Fernando Pessoa got it right when he wrote, "Enthusiasm is sheer vulgarity"? What then, Gloomy Gus? I've always suffered from a sense of Gnostic alienation, although of course I didn't call it that when I was growing up. Maybe I'm just autistic, or an asshole, but on some fundamental level the world has always seemed strange to me, more mysterious and terrible than humans could have made it, all by themselves. I've never been able to shake the creeping intuition that I was born into a hostile realm, not my true home, where the people in charge were being controlled by an ancient, omniscient, malevolent force, beginning with Mom and Dad. You'd be safe in assuming I didn't have a happy childhood. My grandfather on my mother's side was a Methodist minister with a tattoo of the Princeton Tiger on his ass and an arrest record for patronizing prostitutes. When my mother was a little girl, he made her eat her pet rabbit. You can bet she didn't have a happy childhood either. My mother's pet rabbit story now reminds me of an old Bill Hicks routine, censored by the David Letterman Show, about how we commemorate the death and resurrection of Jesus
by telling our children a giant bunny rabbit left chocolate eggs in the night.
Hicks used to imagine Christ looking down at us from heaven, debating the second coming with his heavenly Father.
Do you think when Jesus comes back, he's really going to want to look at a cross? Hell, that may be why he hasn't shown up yet. Well, man, they're still wearing crosses, Dad. I'm not going, no. They totally missed the point. I'm not going. Forget it. I'll go back as a bunny.
In my book about growing up in California, Crash Gordon and the Mysteries of Kingsburg, an ass-kicking Easter bunny shows up in the first chapter. When I was a boy, the mainstream media portrayed Nixon and Kissinger as diplomatic geniuses, even while they were covertly carpet-bombing Cambodia and engaging in at least 57 other varieties of heinous fuckery. Around that same time, the Zodiac Killer was making public threats to blow up school buses full of children in the general vicinity of my hometown. Later, the Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapped Patty Hearst in Berkeley, about 200 miles north. By then, things were getting really weird. Watergate had come along and stripped the diplomatic veneer off Nixon, while leaving his war criminal pal Kissinger's veneer somehow intact. The Zodiac Killer's self-proclaimed death toll had risen to 37, yet he continued to elude capture. And William Randolph Hearst's granddaughter started calling herself Tanya instead of Patty, posing for pictures in front of the SLA's seven-headed cobra symbol, wearing a sleek and fashionable M1 carbine, which she'd used to shoot up a sporting goods store so her new comrades could shoplift a pair of tube socks. And I almost forgot to mention the Manson family murders. In those not-so-long-ago days, California fornication gave the resulting babies a front-row seat at the freak show. Each new generation has its own nightmare version of reality to compete with mine. Did you grow up in New York City during 9/11 and the anthrax attacks? I was there with you. Were you a troubled teen in the Midwest when the Oklahoma City bombing and the Waco siege went down? I've written about those incidents in my books. Did you become a fan of Leonard Cohen while you were a student at McGill University in Montreal, where Dr. Ewan Cameron was conducting his MKULTRA experiments in de-patterning and psychic driving? I've written about that too. Can you forgive me for thinking that a demiurgic or demonic intelligence might be at work on our planet, shaping a future in which dehumanization will be celebrated as human progress? Will you consider the possibility that certain humans are perversely colluding with anti-human forces to steer our historical process? Or are you going to allow the quiet, internal voice of your spirit to be replaced by a fascist soup of algorithms from silicon chips inside ever smarter phones, drones, and robots? The prevailing spirit of our technocratic age seems bent on eradicating most aspects of spirituality, unless that spirituality serves to keep the masses in line, like the pedophile-infested Catholic Church. I could be wrong about that, of course, but am I? What makes you so sure?
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Kevin Spacey said that in his role as Verbal Kint, or Kaiser Soze, in The Usual Suspects, a film directed by Bryan Singer. You're aware of what Kevin Spacey and Bryan Singer have been up to lately, right? Both have been accused of sexually molesting underage boys. And they stole that line from Baudelaire, in case you didn't know. While I was growing up, I was taught to fear the underworld, the world of drug dealers, pimps, hustlers, gangsters, and prostitutes. But now that I'm older, I can see that we have much more to fear from the overworld, the psychopathic power elite and their global conspiracy against the rest of us. After all, it's not your friendly neighborhood pot dealer who's getting rich from fracking while leaving your community with water that catches fire straight from the tap. It's not the National Trade Union of pimp daddies that's blowing trillions of tax dollars on endless, unwinnable wars that only increase the power and wealth of the deep state while screwing over everyone else. Three-card money hustlers aren't primarily to blame for the ravaging of our planet's ecosystem caused by global warming, deforestation, overfishing, strip mining, and Monsanto's version of industrial agriculture. No mafia-made man or a member of Los Zetas is in charge of the predatory financial institutions that have been looting public funds and pensions. and that unmarried mother who makes extra tips by providing handjobs at the local Korean massage parlor has nothing to do with the new slavery ginned up by for-profit prison stockholders working in tandem with an increasingly militarized police force. Or, I should say, she has nothing to do with it until she gets caught. We know and take for granted now that our politicians are bought and sold by corporate interests, that our daily news has been commoditized, and that wars are started under false pretenses. But the level of crime and corruption goes much deeper than that. Hard evidence of the overworld's criminal reign has been suppressed in all the major media outlets in this country, but freedom of the press still allows that evidence to be made public in independent books and on the internet. You just need to do some critical thinking to get a handle on it. You'll pay a steep price for insisting on your own mental sovereignty in this upside-down world, especially in the suburbs. Almost everyone you meet there will want you to think the same way they do. When they find out that you don't, social ostracism is usually the result. It doesn't matter if you're in bland, liberal bourgeois Montclair or in some hardworking, Trump-loving suburb in the Midwest. If you make a conscious decision to retain your individuality in the face of the collective, you're going to be shunned, but it's totally worth it. As Caitlin Johnstone said on this same topic, quote, "Truly standing in your own authority, uninfluenced by propaganda, groupthink, or societal pressures, is one of the most revolutionary things that anyone can possibly do." Unquote. What most suburbanites don't realize is that the mainstream media has been telling them what to think almost since the day they were born. They've been subjected to a relentless corporate media barrage of unprecedented scope and intensity. They're constantly being told what to believe about their leaders and society and just about everything else that's going on in their world. Social hypnosis, Alan Watts called it. Their thoughts are not always their own. Knowing that, I find it odd that more people aren't interested in hearing opposing viewpoints or venturing outside their social media echo chambers. Then again, most people have never been trained in critical thinking or deep reading, so they might not even know how to go about separating facts from propaganda or fake news from the truth about, let's say, false flag terrorism events. Mind control in this country is very real, but it doesn't look anything like a scene out of The Manchurian Candidate or A Clockwork Orange. It's now done with advertising and computer algorithms and plutocrat-owned media outlets like CNN, Fox News, and the Washington Post.
You might call it the spectacle if you're familiar with the situationist texts of Guy Debord.
It's right there, out in the open, but it's subtle. Actually, it's not subtle at all. It's just that we're so immersed in it that most of us can't see it. Like the fish that are unaware of the water they're swimming through in David Foster Wallace's famous Kenyon College commencement address, "This is Water." More about that in Part 2.